When we work garter stitch flat, we make a knit stitch row on one side, then turn our work around and make another knit stitch row. So we only work knit stitch rows back and forth. And this creates a pattern of a sort of a horizontal rib with alternating knit stitch and purl stitch rows. When we try to do this in the round, we can only work on one side. So we will have to alternate the knit stitch rows with the purl stitch rows. And there can be a visible jog in the area where we switch from one type of stitches to another type. The wonderful helical method allows us to alternate the knit stitch rows with the purl stitch rows in a very neat and completely jogless way. The name helical knitting is derived from the word helix, which translates from both Greek and Latin as spiral. To make this work, we need to use two balls of yarn. The first ball will be for the knit stitch rows and the second ball for the purl stitch rows. This is a very simple algorithm. In every row, we stop a few stitches before the end of the row. Pick up the yarn from another ball, work the row, and stop a few stitches before the end of the row, and repeat. I made this little animation to show how it works. Here I have my sample in stockinette stitch. I am knitting in the round using magic loop. I was using just one ball of yarn for the knit stitches only. To do the helical, I will add another ball of yarn that I will be using for purling. So one ball of yarn I'll be using for knitting and another one for purling. I'm adding the new yarn from the purl stitch ball. I will just keep this yarn tail loose and I will hide it later. I'm going to purl one row. Make it snug here. I stopped the purl stitch row 3 stitches before the end of the row. Before I continue, I bring the purl stitch yarn to the front of work and leave it to rest. Next, I slip off 3 knit stitches purlwise onto the right needle tip, like this. And now I take the yarn from the ball that was designated for the knit stitch rows, and I simply continue the knit stitch row. Tighten the first stitch to avoid baggy stitches. Just make sure everything is snug. I will knit the rest of the row in the round and stop 3 stitches before the end of the row. I stopped knitting 3 stitches before the end of the row. And I simply leave the working yarn from my knit stitch ball behind the work to rest. Slip off 3 stitches purlwise onto the right needle tip. Grab the yarn from the purl stitch ball and continue purling, making sure that I tighten the first stitch to make everything snug, and continue purling until again the last 3 stitches of the row. Here I stopped purling 3 stitches before the end of the row, and I simply drop the yarn from my purl stitch ball in front of work, slip off purlwise 3 stitches, take the yarn from my knit stitch ball, knit the first stitch and tighten a little bit to make sure I don't have baggy stitches, and continue knitting until the last 3 stitches of the row. I stopped knitting 3 stitches before the end of the row and simply drop the knit stitch yarn behind work, slip off 3 stitches purlwise onto the right needle tip, and I'm going to use my purl stitch yarn and continue purling. After I purl the first stitch, I tighten a little bit and continue the purl stitch row until the last 3 stitches of the row. It is easy to see where the end of the purl stitch row is because the working yarn is resting in front of work, and this is the area where we would stop. However, it is not as obvious with the knit stitch row because the yarn is resting behind the work, and it's not visible from the front, so it's easy to miss the last 3 stitches. Here is one idea. We can use a marker and place it 3 stitches before the end of the knit stitch row. Or there is another way which I personally prefer, and it's simply always leaving the working yarn in front of work for both knit stitch rows and purl stitch rows. And that makes it very visible, and it's easy to see where the last 3 stitches are. The only thing that needs to be done is when we continue the knit stitch row, we now have to bring the working yarn to the back of our work, and we can continue the knit stitch row. When using the double point needles, instead of stopping 3 stitches before the end of the row, we can stop one section before. I finished a purl stitch row and I leave the working yarn in front to rest. And I have here a knit stitch row that I'm going to continue to knit. I will work the knit stitch row in the round until one section or one needle before the end of the row. Now I finished the knit stitch row, just one section before the yarn from another ball. Now I leave my knit stitch yarn to rest and continue the purl stitch row, starting from here. And continue like this in the round. So every time, instead of leaving 3 stitches at the end of the row, I leave the whole section. When I switch from a rib to garter stitch, I usually change my needle size because I work the rib generally with a smaller needle. And I start with a full knit stitch row. I think this will create a nicer transition from the rib to the garter stitch. I do it all the way in the round, including all the stitches. Here I completed the knit stitch row all the way in the round. Now I will bring my knit stitch yarn to the front of my work and leave it to rest. Take the yarn from the purl stitch ball and start purling. Make sure that the stitches at the beginning of the row are nice and snug. And continue. Continue in the round, again stopping 3 stitches before the end of the row. So this created a nice and neat transition from the rib to the garter stitch.